Thank you. Yaoyi, hello. My name is Jennifer Barrett. I'm the Deputy Vice-Chancellor, Indigenous Strategy and Services here at the University of Sydney. I should actually clarify, I'm the interim, and I'm just here to introduce Uncle Chika, who is a much loved elder who's here to welcome us to country here today. Thank you, Uncle Chika.
Good, thank you. Good morning, folks. My name is Charles Madden, but known around in the city of Sydney as Chika. Now, that's a nickname that I got many years ago going to Redfern Public School, which is now NCIE, the National Centre of Indigenous Excellence. Folks, I'm from Gadigal land, Aboriginal land. That's the land we're on at the moment. For many years, I've been involved with quite a few Aboriginal organisations. I've been a director with the Aboriginal Medical Service at Redfern for over 40 years. Also a director with the Redfern Aboriginal Housing Company, Aboriginal Hostels Australia, and the Metropolitan Local Aboriginal Land Council. I've got to mention it, folks. Also a life member of the Redfern All Blacks Rugby League Football Club. Thank you. Folks, for many years I've lived and worked around the city of Sydney. I'd like to take this opportunity this morning to extend a warm and sincere welcome to all my Aboriginal brothers and sisters, non-Aboriginal brothers and sisters. If we have any brothers and sisters here from the Torres Strait or further afar across the seas, welcome. Welcome to Gadigal land. The Gadigal clan is one of 29 that makes up the Eora Nation. The Eora Nation is bordered by 3 distinctive landmarks. We have the Hawkesbury River to the north, the Peen to the west and the Georges River to the south. Those 3 rivers form the boundaries of the Eora Nation. Folks, if you've travelled across this great city of ours today, the state or this great country, or from afar, welcome. Welcome to Gadigal land. Enjoy your stay. Have a safe and trouble-free trip home. Once again, welcome, welcome, welcome. Enjoy the day, folks. Thank you.
Thank you, Uncle Chika. I'd like to begin too by acknowledging country that we're here on Gadigal land. I'm a guest on this land, a Dunghutti woman from the mid-north coast of New South Wales, which is where my mother's family are from. So today's events are important for the history of our family too, and for many of you here. So it's great to see you all, and thank you all for coming along. Uncle Chika's welcomes are always warm and generous and reliable, and they remind us why we need to respect country, but also he gives us wonderful information about the facts around this land that we call the Eora Nation. So I pay my respects to the elders, past and present, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, colleagues and friends here today. This land has always been a place of learning, a place of storytelling, and it's also been witness to times of resistance and struggle. So it's fitting that we come together here to reflect on an event that helped shape the course of Indigenous rights and social justice in Australia. This event has shaped our university too. So it's an honour to be here together with members of the original Freedom Ride, as well as the Perkins family, to commemorate one of the most significant acts of student activism in Australian history. It's an event that exposed deep-seated racism, challenged segregation, and helped lay the foundation for change. As we know, in February 1965, a group of University of Sydney students led by Dr. Charles Perkins embarked on a 15-day journey through regional New South Wales to document and protest the discrimination faced by Aboriginal people. What began as a fact-finding mission quickly became a national moment of reckoning. The ride travelled through Wellington, Gulungambone, Walgett, Moree, Boggabilla, Lismore, Kempsey and Barraville, and in town after town, the Freedom Riders witnessed racism in everyday life. Segregation in public places, exclusion from swimming pools and cinemas, and deep social and economic inequality. But they didn't just observe, they confronted, they asked questions, they followed up. This morning, we are honoured to welcome representatives from the Walgett Aboriginal Medical Service, just one of the Aboriginal communities that was involved in and affected by the Freedom Ride. Thank you for being here today. Each of the towns that I've mentioned so far, and I'm sure there were many others where there were whistle stops, as my nan used to call them, there'd be other towns that people went through, and it's known that this ride had a deep impact on these many communities. The Freedom Riders and their brave actions changed the lives of many, so many in these communities, and that change continues to be felt. This group of young students took a stand against a system that had been in place for generations, and it was with their courage that helped change Australia. We are so fortunate to be joined by some of the original Freedom Riders today. It is a true privilege, and it's their determination that made this journey possible. And I'd like to take a moment to honour all of those who took part in the 1965 Freedom Ride with a roll call. No need to put your hand up or say present. So I will start with Jim Spiegelman, Brian Aarons, Anne Kurthwoys, Gary Williams, Warwick Richards, Alan Alfred, John Butterworth, Bob Gallagher, Beth Hanson, Susan Johnson, Colin Bradford, Louise Hyman, Hall Greenland, Alex Mills, Chris Page, Wendy Watson-Eckstein, David Pepper, John Gowdy, Sue Reeves, Barry Corr, Aidan Foy, Helen Gray, Pat Healy, Matchtailed Hully, Robin Iredale, Derek Malloy. I would also like to pay respects to the Freedom Riders who have left the bus and are no longer with us. Dr. Charles Perkins, Norm Mackay, Judith Rich, Das Cassidy, Rick Collins, Ray Lepek, Jerry Mason, Paddy Dawson, and John Powles. Your actions 60 years ago remain an enduring reminder that activism and advocacy have the power to transform society. Our children and many of our students here at the University of Sydney still learn about this moment in history. Your legacy lives on. This event will reflect on what it meant to be part of the Freedom Ride, the challenges that were faced, and the impact it had. And it is definitely an enduring one. Thank you all for being here today to honour this moment in history. And I now invite the University of Sydney's Vice-Chancellor and President, Professor Mark Scott, to begin our discussion. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Jen, and ladies and gentlemen, it's wonderful to be with you in this packed room today. Shortly I'm going to invite up those who were there, those who took part, and we look forward to hearing their stories, their reminiscences, their insights 60 years on. But as we begin, I'd like to thank Uncle Chicka for his welcome and begin by acknowledging traditional owners and the land in which we meet, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and pay my respects to elders past and present. The University of Sydney turns 175 years this year. Australia's oldest university, no doubt. Australia's finest university, possibly, but we assert it with confidence. But it's interesting, we take great pride in being Australia's oldest university, and we say now for the best part of 2 centuries, teaching and learning and discovery of knowledge and sharing of knowledge has been a hallmark of what has happened here. But when we acknowledge traditional owners, we recognise that not for 2 centuries, but for 600 centuries, teaching and learning and discovery and sharing of knowledge has been a hallmark of what has taken place on these lands. And so we build on that experience and that insight and that wisdom in all that we do, and recognition of that is central to our One Sydney Many People strategy that we have here at the university. When you're a university as old as us, you've got to, in a sense, come to terms with your history. And there's history we're proud of, but there's also history that we need to explore. We take great pride, I think, that the Freedom Ride started here. We take great pride that Dr. Charles Perkins was the first graduate from here. One of our most wonderful modern buildings on campus is named after Charles Perkins. But at the same time, we also need to recognise that it took more than 100 years for this university to graduate its first Aboriginal student. And so we need to think through what were the conditions and the environment in our society and the way that we operated as a university that impeded opportunity being on offer to Aboriginal students before that time. And as we come to terms with our history, we need to think through where we are today and again ask the question, even though we have more Aboriginal students enrolled at the university than any time in our history, are we doing all we can to identify entrenched disadvantage, discrimination, holding back of opportunities, and is this really a place where talent can flourish irrespective of background, and are we committed to that journey? I think we are, but as we come to terms with the past and learn from the past, it provides us with insight for all that we need to be doing now and all that lies ahead. So it's wonderful to be able to remember that it's 60 years ago to the day that the bus returned after this memorable journey through New South Wales. And so it's a great honour to be able to invite 4 original participants to join us. Gary Williams, Gunbunyan Bunjalung man who has dedicated his life to advocacy for Aboriginal rights and rallying against racial discrimination. Gary, will you come and join us up on the stage here? Will you welcome Gary? Thank you, Gary. Jim Spiegelman is with us today. He went from his time on the Freedom Rides to be president of the SRC here and student fellow of the University Senate, and then such a distinguished career in the law and Australian public life. Jim, welcome. Thanks for coming. And Anne Curthoys went from her time on the Freedom Rides to be an Australian historian and academic. And you could see the signs of that because she kept a diary, which has been such an important artefact as we've tried to remember these times. Anne, join us with you. And Brian Aarons was an Australian activist and a member of the Freedom Rides while studying at the University of Sydney. Brian, great to have you with us. Come and join us too. So 60 years ago, do you remember it like it was yesterday, Anne? Do you remember the bus coming back?
I do remember it. I remember it as very, that we were all exhausted.
Yeah.
Is the main thing I remember. I actually wanted to read out a tiny bit of my diary. I'm not going to do this
We're glad you kept it.
over and over. I
This is
just,
good.
just this one time, because this is my diary for diary entry, Tari, Friday, 26th of February. Woke early, had breakfast, which was horrible, curried baked beans. At about 8:30 a.m. we got going. We stopped at Purfleet Reserve for half an hour, talking to the people there, but we had to be off, and so we pushed on to Newcastle, getting there in time for lunch. After that, and a lot of swimming went on in this diary. We swam our way around New South Wales. We went on to Sydney. We had a rule about no drinking so that we wouldn't turn up to the press conference drunk and smelly. We all got very tense, etc., near the end because of the press conference. We had tea at Hornsby and then we drove on to uni. When we arrived, there was Ted Noffs, a few pressmen, some parents, etc., but that's about all. There were no Aboriginal people or other supporters. We found out later that Ted Noffs did not told anyone when and where we were arriving. And I think he was a great supporter, so I think he had his reasons, but we didn't really know what they were. After that, some of us went to John Powell's place for a wind-up party. About 10:30 p.m, I left and went home thoroughly exhausted. So that was...
There we are.
That was
60 years ago today. Jim, as you reflect on it, the Freedom Rides, almost the name drew a bit from the American experience and the civil rights movements as it has emerged. And we look back on this as an historic event now. Did it feel like you were making history at the time? And when you were planning it, did you have any idea of the implications that would come from it?
I don't remember what I had for breakfast that day. But the planning was involved with a number of academics on this campus. One, Bill Ford, was a guy who actually went on the American Freedom Ride, and he then became, unfortunately, an academic at a different university, but whatever. But at the time, we also had Peter Westaway, who taught government. Charlie and I sat next to each other in his classes. They got together after the demonstration against American attacks on Negroes and all the, I mean, there were lynches and all the rest of it. And it was a particularly big demonstration, and we were criticised, not we, but people were criticised for saying, well, why are you attacking Americans when you've got your own problem? And that actually struck home, particularly with Charlie and others, including Peter Westaway and Bill Ford. Bill came up with the idea of the Freedom Ride because he'd had that experience. And it was, that was the origin, if you like.
Yeah.
People, I don't remember coming back, but I do remember leaving. And Ted Noffs was there too, and he was really an inspiration in many ways. But I just want to mention the academics who were actually important in the initiative.
Now, Gary, you were one of the 2 Aboriginal students who were enrolled at the University of Sydney at the time of the Freedom Rides, along with Dr. Charles Perkins. What are your memories of the planning of the trip and what you thought might be achieved from the trip?
Well, I don't know. We went to SAFA meetings, and actually in 1964 I was staying with Charlie, so went along to these meetings, and there was no, for myself, no long-range views, but I was there and interested. And basically, there were students who were basically, they were, because of the Students' Action for Aborigines, they wanted to do something. Yes.
Brian, had you been to these parts of New South Wales before? What was your background and your interest in this
No,
work?
I hadn't. I had not been to those parts of New South Wales. I did grow up in a family that was very strongly knew about discrimination against Aboriginal people, and in the outer southwestern suburb where we lived of Fairfield, there was an Aboriginal woman who was married to a white man, and they had several sons. And most of that working class neighbourhood banned their kids playing with the sons. And our family, my mother said, no, Billy Stemp is welcome in our home. So it goes back a long way, the recognition. But to be honest, I don't think any of us had any idea of the blatant racism in these towns. And we were very lucky that we had Charlie and Gary, because of course they did know of it. Gary had personally experienced it. And Charlie, as Anne's book recounts, had actually, he had a very wide circle of Aboriginal friends. There was a whole network. He was well aware, and I think Anne's book describes him actually doing a trip with one of the television stations around some of the same towns, not all of them. So when we got to those towns, was the first time that I think we experienced actual blatant racism with the white people that we argued with or who turned up. In the case of Moree, I describe it as the second time at Moree was like a near white race riot. Near white race riot.
Yeah.
So yes, it was the actual experience, Mark, that led us to, understand the depth of it. Other than that, I think for most of us, we knew it just by repute.
In theory, yeah. And one of the interesting things, I think just looking into it and as you've documented, it wasn't simply let's put a media spotlight on this. I mean, you went and you did research, you were doing surveys, you were kind of going around and meeting people and learning from that experience. Tell us a little bit about almost like the research that you were trying to do as part of this.
Well, it's interesting. The surveys were actually quite important because, and there's a lot of discussion about the formation of the surveys and drawing up different surveys dealing with health or education or housing or access to town, facilities in town. And the idea was that we knew that there's a lot that we didn't know. So the idea was that to go and talk to people, to find out what we could, and that was partly to be the basis on which we would decide whether or not to take action in a particular town. And in some towns, we did the surveys, but we realised we didn't really have the connections with the local Aboriginal people to really conduct an action. Though in Walgett we did, and then in Moree we did. So that changed. But the surveys were really important. And you listed, I think, some of the other towns like Galagamone and Wellington and so on. Because that's actually how the Freedom Riders got to understand more, but it also just set up a basis for talking and communicating and so on. So now, then the surveys, we never actually wrote the survey up in the way that was intended. Everyone went off to life. And for years, when I was writing the book, for a long time I couldn't find the surveys. And I was, I really wanted these surveys because they were all filled in. And eventually found out they were in Pat Healy's house that she'd found when she was decluttering or something. And so I finally had the surveys. But the reason I mention that is, very soon after that, there was I hope this is not going too far away, but the Canberra fires happened. I lived in Canberra. And I suddenly got very, very worried that I had all this Freedom Ride material in my house and that my house could get burnt down, which in fact Pat's was. And so I donated a lot of material to IATSIS at the time. And so that's partly how IATSIS came to have my diary. I would never have thought of doing that.
Yeah, well.
So I handed all this stuff over. But to get back to your question, the surveys, I think, were an important part of our action, even though we didn't ever actually write it up. They were crucial to how we got around and talked to people.
Can I add to that?
Yeah.
As the secretary, I did a lot of writing
Yeah.
to people, and we knew which towns we were going to in part because other people had heard stories
Yeah.
or had experiences, and all that correspondence is in the State Library now.
Right. And Jim, you were also involved in secretary documenting it, but photographs and video, were you constructing that story as well?
I had an 8mm camera phone at home, and I brought it with me.
Yeah.
And so I started using it.
Yeah.
It's got a lot of footage that before any other television or media joined us, that's the only footage there is.
Yeah.
After we got knocked off the road,
Yeah.
out of Walgett, media suddenly got interested.
So
As
can
we
you
said,
just tell us that story? I mean, so this was not designed as a media exercise with the media trailing you as you went out, really, but the media discovered this journey more as you were out there, yeah?
Well, I remember the stop at Dubbo, which we didn't do anything there, but we met the Sydney Morning Herald representative who did that part of New South Wales.
Yeah.
And he'd never had a decent story for a long time. and he said, well, this sounds interesting, I'll join the bus, which he did.
Yeah.
And he was the only one who followed any stories until we got knocked off the road.
Yeah, and tell us what happened being knocked off the road.
Well, it was very dangerous.
Yeah.
It was, without the skill of the driver, we would have had a lot of injuries.
Yeah.
Because there was a dip right next to the road where we were hit. We'd been followed out of the Walgett where we'd had a basketball game with some of the locals, which we lost, and a lot.
Yeah.
And I can remember the cavalcade behind us
Yeah.
of all these cars that were following us out of town, and there was a lot of anxiety on the bus
Yeah.
about who these people were.
Yeah.
Increased after we were knocked off the road, and Charlie remembers me and wrote this up. I said, I took a bottle up, went to the front and said, women to the back. God knows what I had in mind. Anyway, whatever it was, it turned out...
rejected that, Jim.
Anyway, whatever it was, it turned out to be all of the local Aborigines who'd attended this basketball game who were following us. So it turned out okay.
Not quite as ominous as it may have been, but there were tough moments. Gary and Brian, one moment was when you entered the Barraville Hotel and challenged the racial segregation that existed there. Can you reflect on that moment? Take us back to being in that hotel and just recognising the hostility towards what you were trying to advocate there.
Tell the story about the milkshakes, Gary.
Of course, Barraville was, it's become a story all around actually, because we used to say they had the first takeaway milkshakes in Australia, across the road from the pub, and because we couldn't drink any on using their... Anyway, it's come to Queensland, so no, we were the first. So it's all... But yes, we... I do think that even if there was opposition, you know, you had cameras there, you had journalists there, you had freedom riders there. Did you feel, you know, the photo shows that we ordered it and he didn't hesitate. And you know, we all knew of where they were served. You know, you can play in the first grade football team and all that. They work with them and all those type of things, and it was all the way through the back window. Mm. So yes, it was a good feeling to know that you can. They had to pass it over the counter to you in the front bar.
Serve you at the bar.
Yeah.
What are your memories, Brian, of Barraville?
Well, Gary should have told a story that he told on a very good 9-minute witness history program on the BBC. And I think this illustrates the depth of racism.
Yeah.
As a kid growing up, what he said on the program was, we used to say that Barraville invented the first takeaway milkshake because they'd make the milkshakes in those aluminium containers and other people would be served that with a glass, but if you were Aboriginal, they would pour it into a plastic container and you had to go and drink it outside. Now, you know, that is a little simple story in itself, but that demonstrates what we're up against. What Gary and other Aboriginal people were up against. And let's not forget, in Bowraville, unlike the back of the bus in the southern United States, the Aboriginal people in Bowraville, when they went to the cinema, had to sit in right at the front in the first few rows up against the screen in chatty old wooden chairs, whereas everyone else had the usual kind of country theatre type films. So on that day, yes, well, the Bowraville Publican was very well aware that media were there, and the photo of Gary and I is kind of a happen chance because, yes, we all went in. I mean, Charlie was there, several other people, I think Jim and others. No, maybe not. Anyway, a few of us were in the pub, despite the rule against drinking that Anne mentioned before. So the Sydney Morning Herald photographer, it just so happened Gary and I were at the bar ordering, and he said, "Hey, do you mind if you two sit down?" And the photo was taken. And as I think a story in The Guardian recently said, it's one of those happen chances. It was a happen chance, but it became a defining image of the tour. That photo was put up about 4 years ago on the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age, This Day in History.
Yeah.
And the guy who told Meredith Bergman, another historian from here, that it had the hugest number of hits that they'd had for a long time. I think in the first few days, 250,000 hits. So it showed that it said something to people in a way that maybe a lot of words didn't. You know?
Jim, there's been...
And I think it was the next day in the Sydney Morning Herald in the letters column. Haven't the Freedom Riders got anything better to do than to get Aborigines drinking?
That's right. That's right.
Yeah.
That was the great crime, yes.
Jim, can you just explain to us the legal context in this environment? We live now in a world where there's anti-discrimination laws, and so for many of us, hearing those stories of such, blatant discrimination is almost bewildering. What were there any laws at the time that protected that kind of treatment in the cinema and in the pub or wherever else, or could a proprietor just do as they decided they wanted to do?
At the time, I hadn't gone to law school
Yeah.
yet, but I don't think there was one.
Yeah. So the exposure of that for many people, say the readers of the Sydney Morning Herald.
The impact we had, we owe it to one person, the driver of that truck. That's what got the media really interested. Okay, you were there at the time at the Fairfax, weren't you?
No.
Not yet. Literally close.
Yeah.
But whatever it was, that suddenly got the media interested.
Yeah.
So there was a time when Charlie was flown down to Sydney for Channel 7, Peter Westaway's show, while we stayed. We were on the way back to Moree for the second visit, and he was flown down out of Moree on his own to Sydney. Did that show. It was, it was having an impact immediately at that point. And to be quite frank, we owe it to the driver of the truck. He should get a medal. Without him, we wouldn't have had that impact.
It's true. The biggest own goal ever.
Yeah. And if he's still alive, he would hate that.
As that impact and awareness grew over the time, how did that change the reaction when the bus arrived in town? And you talk through a bit the reaction in places like Moree.
Well, some of us went to, for the 50th anniversary,
Yeah.
went back to Moree, and it was a big impact. But as I think I've mentioned to some of you here, that the Metropolitan Land Council had this ball in which a dozen people from different parts of New South Wales, including towns we didn't go to, got up and gave speeches saying, you changed our lives. It was quite an impactful evening for us who went there. And it was widespread. It wasn't just the towns we went to. But, sure, go on. No, fine.
I think it took quite a long time to realise just what that impact had been. I don't think we were very aware of it in the 70s and the 80s.
Yeah.
I mean, it seems to have grown over time, like this century, really. Even 2005, there was an event here at the university, and there was a student retracing of the Freedom Ride. That was very important. But I do think it was 2015 when the penny started to drop, just how well remembered it was in those towns and in general. So it's interesting because often people lose interest over time. This one seems to have gained interest over time.
There was some small impact immediately after.
Yeah.
We came back, Charlie and I went on television and debated with the then Premier about what had happened and what he's going to do about it. Well, it turned out bugger all. But whatever, it was on the agenda.
Do you see a link to the 67 referendum from the attention and publicity?
I believe that it had an effect because Australians did not understand or know anything about the extent of discrimination. One of the things that, for me, was most powerful was in Walgett, Aboriginal returned servicemen were not allowed to join the RSL club. Now, these are people who, sort of offered their lives for the country, and they weren't allowed to join the club. I think that hit a few, when it got out as a fact, that hit a few people's mind. It was a really nasty way of discrimination.
What about the strategy and the tactics? Part of the significant debate within the American civil rights movement, and I think in other such movements of community action, has been whether direct action should be absolutely embedded in non-violent principles, or whether in fact there are times where a full array of measures may need to be used to bring about change. Was there how did you think through how you would deal with violence if violence surrounded you here?
I'll just say quickly, I think the non-violent direct action idea was crucial to the Freedom Ride. It was really, really important. And it was taken from Martin Luther King and his politics, and was very seriously discussed by us beforehand and during the Freedom Ride. And I think it's part of the reasons for its success. As to whether it is always the only option, that's a separate question, but I think for us, in that context, it was absolutely the right option. Yeah.
Brian,
Yeah, just to add to that, as I think Aidan Foy might have described it, we had a Bible which was Martin Luther King's very famous letter from Birmingham jail.
Okay.
And the point about that was two things. One was he was replying to his critics, both black and white, in the churches, who were saying, you're just disrupting things, all this civil disobedience and stuff, it's not going to help black people. And he was replied very strongly to that. But he also emphasised it must be non-violent direct action. And the other term, which has been a bit lost, but Charlie was very fond of, which was constructive conflict. Yes, we are going to a town, yes, we are creating trouble, in a sense, for the white people, and maybe for the Aboriginal people. And Darryl French, in a recent ABC, quite long and very good story, actually confirms that some of the Aboriginal people are saying, we don't know whether this is a good idea, because they will come here, create issues, and then they will go and we'll have to cop it. That's not what the communities think today, which I think is one of the most wonderful things. But those two notions, non-violent direct action, and we are going to take action. And that was one person left the bus because he decided he disagreed with that whole strategy. The rest of us were very firmly, when we see injustice, we will take action, but it will be non-violent, and if there's violence, it won't be us. But also the strategic idea that we're going to create constructive conflict, because how do you change an unjust system if some people don't point it out and take action against it?
Yeah.
And I think I'll go to Anne's book, and she's got something unbearable. I call them postcards. You know, just little things that are, at a glance you could see what's going on. And she pointed out how certain people there who were Aboriginal people who actually stood up to their white confronters and as well as talked to the Yarn mob and talked to the white people and made it clear that, you know, they were with the Freedom Riders. And you can do your worst, but we're with them.
Considerable courage
Yes.
from those communities that
Yes.
stayed as you returned home. 60 years ago, how is this possible with such a youthful panel? I know you're all thinking that. They were incredibly young. Incredibly young. And I think it's just interesting to reflect on that this very significant change with profound impact was really driven by university students, undergraduate university students.
Could I just say
Yeah.
that? I walked over here from Newtown and went down Carillion Avenue and up this way, and all these young people. Oh, that's right.
Yeah,
we were the
that's
same
right.
age.
You were one of them, Gary. You were one of them. They look younger every year, Gary. I can tell you it's part of the challenge. But the issues you were talking about, although the circumstances are different, this still remains the unfinished business of the nation, right? This is the unfinished business of the nation, 60 years on. So to those young people today, and many of them who would be concerned about the struggle for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander rights, self-determination, the targeting of ongoing discrimination, what advice to a new generation of activists on how best to engage society, put a focus on the issue and be a driver of social change the way that you were 60 years ago?
I don't think we're a model for that because our focus was on discrimination from the American Civil Rights Movement for the blacks in America.
Yeah.
But the issues that were just beginning at that time, the land rights issue had started in the Northern Territory but wasn't widely known.
Was not, yeah.
So to say that we were going to be like the American blacks was wrong. Our issues were like the American Indians and their cultural, and that's the model now, and has been for some time. We didn't go that way because people weren't talking in that language except in the Northern Territory with the cattle. That was the only place it had already emerged.
Interesting.
Could I make...
What?
Sorry, go on.
Yeah, Anne, and then...
I think I agree with that, but I also think what you get from the Freedom Ride is the importance of Aboriginal leadership, the importance of Charles Perkins. It would not have been a success if Charles wasn't involved, I think. But at the same time, the importance of non-Aboriginal people, of supporters and allies. And I think for a lot of school children, that is something that I pick up that they get, that you need both. I mean, you need Aboriginal leadership on Aboriginal issues, but allies or supporters or other non-Aboriginal people their support is really important. It's not something minor. And so I think that's partly what people take from the Freedom Ride. That would be my feeling about it.
Yeah, Brian.
Yes, one point I'd always like to make is that on that bus, and the people who signed up to be on the trip, they self-defined themselves in. They came to the meetings, etc., etc. But there were young Christians, there were humanists, there was a range of political views, a member of a conservative political party sitting here today, members of the Labor Party, people more left than that. And we were united around, all of us, from whatever direction we were coming, were against racism and wanted to do something about it. So that's the first point. I agree with what Anne has said, and also just to make this point, and apropos of the whole campaign after the Uluru Statement from the Heart and the Voice referendum, this is a white fella issue as well as a black fella issue. You know, this is something about the nation as a whole, and you know how our nation sees itself, what it does, young white students from Sydney were going to these towns, and there was a lot of resentment at that. But the Aboriginal woman who stood up in the middle of Walgett at midnight after the bus had been run off the road and who tore strips off the whites, if you read it in Anne's book, an impassioned speech in which she identified the fact that the whites of Walgett didn't like it, that whites from Sydney were coming up and, in her words, criticising them. She ended that great speech with what I think is a wonderful line using the words black and white, and the worst class of white people, Walgett had the worst class of white people this side of the black stump. And I'll make one other point. There was a real hero, more of a hero than us, in Moree, a guy called Bob Brown, not that Bob Brown, who ran a little electrical trade store, who had been elected to the council a few years before, the Moree City Council, discovers on the books that there is this racist bylaw, gets up at the council and moves that it be removed, and quotes the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights, 1961 in Moree, an ordinary white guy. After all the events, it was him who told us that the council had rescinded what their agreement was, which led to us coming back. His shop windows were smashed. He ended up having to move to the North Coast. I've always thought, if there's a hero, it was this white guy in Moree.
Yeah. Just looping back to something you said there, Brian.
Could I just...
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
Just to, a freedom rider, some of the practicalities of being able to approach those communities up there. We had in our committee meetings leading up to the departure, some of those were at the Wayside Chapel, we had some there. And one of the questions that came up amongst us was, how do we approach these communities? And we had a few people came along, said, oh, I'm from this town, that town. And he said, what you are going to find, the students, you're going to find a very receptive attitude to you. You're one of us. You're white. Now, you're students, you're scruffy, but all of our families have got a scruffy student amongst us. We can trust them, as long as they're white, they can be scruffy. How do we get to strike up a conversation? So one of the suggestions was, this is where the program to have a survey came from. Because everybody's had this experience in the street. Someone approaches you to talk to you. Who are you? Oh, you've got a clipboard. You must know what you're talking about. So give all of us students a clipboard to be able to approach, the excuse to approach people in the street. So let's have a survey. Now, my personal position was, I was the privilege of being the only engineer amongst the freedom riders. Now, you know the students, the engineering faculty, got a bit of privilege. So they said, well, let's keep Bob active, keep him involved. I was given the requirement to prepare the survey on housing. Why wouldn't they pick me? I'm an engineer. So I went along, I knew nothing about regulations there. I just went along to RIDE department and said, if I were to build a house They give me the regulations. Oh yeah, here it is. Yes, do what you like. So we had this, I constructed the survey, and Pat has them, as you say. Pat has all the surveys that were filled in. He said, just go off into the streets and say, we're doing a survey on housing. What's the quality of the housing? Work the conversation around. And what about Aboriginal housing? Oh, no, you know, they look after themselves. You know, the whites look after us. We're in charge of the council. We're in charge of getting all the regulation through to suit us, but we exclude them. And I think that was part of, because they'll all be friendly to you, so how to break through to that and get a discussion. And one of the things we found was that when you start digging in and asking relevant questions, you came up with one of the facts, for example, the council are in charge of electricity. Where's the substation? Oh, where do Aborigines live? Out there, beyond the boundary. Is there any electricity out there? Oh no, electricity is for the white people in town. Aborigines don't need electricity. You know, they've got so many years of experience in the bush. So there was that attitude, and we had to be able to then break through that and say, well, it's not the same for everybody. Thanks very much for buying me a beer in the pub, because you are a white student. And we had that reception. We had to break through that.
Yeah.
So
And the survey was a powerful mechanism for that. Thank you for that. Brian, I just want to go back to one thing you said, because I think one of the interesting things we can see, and I think our students are dealing with it, but it's a manifestation of broader challenges in society. In media, you've got a breakdown of large traditional media outlets through social media, the conversation. There can be an argument that people are just talking to themselves and listening to themselves, and there's a great fragmentation or a segmentation. One of the interesting things I think you said was it was just a very kind of broad and inclusive group that you brought together around this issue. And how much do you think in lessons to today's students, that sense of you need to reach out, and you may need to reach out to people whose life experiences and political views and ideologies might be quite different to those that you hold, but it's in that diversity that can come a real power and impact when it comes to driving social change?
Well, the others might like to comment too, but I just think it's very important when issues arise that all those who agree about that issue, whatever it is, the Voice is a good example, can work together and agree on that and not let other issues intrude. And I think this is one of the problems of movements, and I really hesitate to apply my life experience and 60 years ago to today's situation. One has to be very careful about that. And yet you do see what you said quite correctly about the fragmentation and the tendency in movements to split off from each other and forget what the original thing was. And if we look at, if there's a central issue confronting humanity at the moment, it's the climate catastrophe that is hanging over us. And really all those, whatever their views and whatever their views about solutions, who see that as an issue are going to have to come together, because the human tendency to deny, and ignore problems, combined with the self-interest of those, and we can relate it back to the self-interest of whites in the towns. They thought their self-interest was to keep the Aboriginal people in their place. Those people always know what it is that they're against, or what they're going to reject. Those who want, reforms and change that are demanded by the objective situation, they need to find that kind of a unity and to be focused on whatever the issue of the moment is.
One final question. We're just about out of time, but I'd like to hear from all on the panel on this. I think we can make a strong argument that the Freedom Ride, the work of these students over just a fortnight, 60 years ago, changed the nation and changed the lives of many Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in the communities they visited, but had an impact far beyond that, a profound impact of the work of young people at a tender age in their lives. It changed the nation. How did the experience change you? And have you reflected on the impact of this experience on all that followed in your life? Brian, we'll start with you and we'll go through the panel. Yeah.
As I've described, I had certain views about the world at the time, but the thing about the Freedom Ride was the knowledge that you can actually make change, that it is actually worth going out there, working for change, but with that breadth of vision that I described before, and inclusiveness, if you like, and seeking to unite people rather than divide them. But the other thing, of course, I think to say, Mark, is that there's happen chances in these things. When we set out, as I've said in emails to get people to reach out to all the Freedom Ride people that we could find, we influenced Australia, and Anne's book describes it very well and summarises it very well, in ways that we never imagined when we set out, all those years ago. So and as Jim rightly said, the young Greys era ran the bus off the road, and I said this at my retirement in the Commonwealth Public Service. I wondered whether to this day he realised that he had actually made the Freedom Ride, as did the racists elsewhere, by the way. The Walgett RSL, the second Moree swimming pool, near White Race Ride, as I've said. They actually made it because people in the big cities had no idea of this level of racism in our own country.
Yeah. Gary, reflections on how the Freedom Ride changed you?
Only in the sense that, you had the ongoing, calendar of events. So you had the referendum 2 years later, and being involved with helping with that. Later on, the Aboriginal Legal Service, and generally, which meant going out to communities and talking to people who then talked about the Freedom Ride, even if the Freedom Ride hadn't gone through that area down the South Coast, so it gave me generally a wider sense of people who were involved, so that I could talk to and talk to on a level that a level playing field, I suppose. We had Uncle Chickamadden here, and back in the 60s and all that type of thing in Redfern. So I used that experience to like talking up the legal service and things like that. Yeah.
Thanks, Gary. Jim?
Well, I was at that stage 19, and unquestionably the Freedom Ride experience made me more confident in terms of my involvement as I was already being involved in various aspects. Some would say it didn't make me more confident, it just made me more arrogant. But they're related concepts.
Thanks. And Anne?
Well, it had a huge effect on me. I mean, I went on to become an academic, and my PhD was basically on racism. I mean, I took a number of things out of it, but one of it was this question about racism. What really is it about, right? And why does it persist? And I think we're still facing this same question. And I feel I've been asking it all my academic life, really, and not kind of, giving different kinds of answers. But so that the PhD was both on the origins of the White Australia policy and on New South Wales ideas about Aboriginal people and policies and so on. So, and I've gone on and done lots of other things, but I think that continuing concern with both understanding racism and how to combat it, on the one hand, and the engagement with Aboriginal people either in those communities or, in my case, in education, like through supervising Aboriginal students and so on. Those two things, the engagement with Aboriginal people and trying to nut out just what racism's about and how to put a stop to it. That would be mine.
Well, what a privilege for all of us to hear these stories today. Living history, in a way. So vivid in the stories that are told from those who were there, but the lessons still so relevant and compelling to the unfinished business of the nation that we're all still engaged in. It's been an honour to have you with us, so will you thank our panel, Brian, Gary, Jim and Anne?